The GPS showed Ivan was driving through downtown Chicago at 3:47 a.m. But outside his windshield was nothing but endless cornfield. His odometer had been spinning backward for the last 100 miles, and the radio kept playing the same traffic report from 1987, warning drivers about an accident that killed a trucker named Elliot. That's his partner's name. And according to the logbook, Elliot died 3 hours ago. Welcome back to the Verified Fears horror family, where we dive into the darkest corners of reality and uncover the stories that refuse to stay buried. My refrigerated trailer started whispering numbers in a language I'd never heard before, counting down from what sounded like 1,000. By the time I realized what was happening, we'd already reached 0. I've been hauling pharmaceuticals for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of cargo malfunction possible. Temperature fluctuations, power failures, even had a load of insulin freeze solid during a blizzard in Montana. But nothing prepared me for what happened on Highway 50 through Nevada, when my refrigerated load started counting down in a language that shouldn't exist. My name is Ivan, and I drive a white Volvo VNL with a 53-foot reefer trailer. I take pride in my perfect delivery record, never lost a load, never had a temperature violation, never missed a deadline. That streak ended on a Tuesday night in February 2018, somewhere between Ely and Fallon, when the desert decided to teach me that some cargo has a mind of its own. The run started normally enough. Picked up a sealed load in Sacramento. High-value pharmaceuticals bound for a research facility in Denver. The paperwork was standard except for one thing. The shipper insisted I maintain exactly 36.7 degrees Fahrenheit, not the usual 35 to 38 degree range. Seemed odd, but pharmaceutical companies are picky about their temperatures. The trailer was already loaded and sealed when I arrived, which wasn't unusual for high-security freight. What was unusual was the weight. The bills showed 43,000 pounds, but my truck scales read closer to 50,000. I figured it was dense packaging and didn't think much about it. The trouble started around midnight, about 6 hours into the run. I was cruising through that desolate stretch of Highway 50 they call the loneliest road in America, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. At first, I thought it was CB chatter bleeding through my radio, numbers being called out in sequence. But the CB was off, and the sound was coming from behind me, from the trailer. I pulled over at the next wide spot and did a walk-around inspection. Everything looked normal. Trailer doors sealed, refrigeration unit humming at exactly 36.7 degrees. No signs of damage or tampering. But when I put my ear to the trailer wall, I could hear it clearly. A rhythmic counting in what sounded like an ancient language, each number distinct and deliberate. I called dispatch, but my satellite phone couldn't get a signal. That's when I noticed something impossible. My GPS showed I was still moving east at 65 mph, but I was parked on the shoulder with my engine off. The little truck icon on the screen was traveling through towns I'd never heard of. Phantom Ridge, Shadow Haven, Whisper Falls. I zoomed out on the map, but these places didn't exist on any atlas I'd ever seen. The counting from the trailer grew louder, more urgent, and I realized it was descending. Whatever was in there was counting down to something. I got back in the cab and tried to start the engine, but nothing happened. The electrical systems were dead. Yet somehow the refrigeration unit kept running, maintaining that precise 36.7 degrees. The counting continued, and I began to make out a pattern. Every 100th number, there was a pause, followed by what sounded like coordinates. I grabbed my paper atlas and tried to plot the numbers, but they corresponded to locations that were underwater, in the middle of mountain ranges, or in areas that had been evacuated decades ago after nuclear testing. That's when I noticed the time on my dashboard clock was running backward. It had been 12:47 a.m. when I first heard the counting. Now it read 11:23 p.m., and the numbers were still retreating. I watched in horror as the minutes ticked away in reverse, taking me back to before this nightmare began. But the counting from the trailer never stopped, never paused, never wavered from its relentless descent toward zero. I tried the CB radio and finally got a response. A gravelly voice from another trucker who claimed to be hauling the same route I was on. But when I asked for his location, he said he was driving through Austin, Nevada in 1987, hauling a load that had been counting down for 31 years. He told me his name was Cole, and he'd been trying to find someone who could hear what he was hearing. The cargo had reached zero once before, he said, and that's when everything went wrong. Towns started disappearing from maps, people began forgetting places that used to exist, and time itself started moving in circles. The counting from my trailer hit 100, then 50, then 20. With each descending number, I felt something fundamental changing around me. The landscape outside my windows shifted subtly. Rock formations rearranged themselves. The road curved in directions it hadn't before. And the stars overhead formed constellations I'd never seen. At 10, my truck began moving on its own, following the GPS route through those phantom towns that shouldn't exist. At 5, I could hear other voices joining the countdown. Other drivers who had carried this same cargo, all of us connected across decades by whatever was sealed in our trailers. At 0, everything stopped. The counting, the backward clock, the phantom movement. For a moment, there was absolute silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigeration unit, maintaining its impossible precision. Then I heard the trailer doors unlock, with a soft click, even though I never touched the release. The GPS showed I had arrived at my destination, a facility that existed in multiple locations simultaneously, serving deliveries that had been made across different decades. I never opened those trailer doors. Some cargo is meant to stay sealed, especially when it's been counting down to a moment that reshapes reality itself. When morning came, I was parked at a truck stop outside Reno, my logbook showing a normal delivery to Denver with a signature I didn't remember making. But every night since then, when I'm driving through the loneliest stretches of highway, I can still hear the counting starting again somewhere behind me, beginning its descent toward the next 0. The next moment when the world rearranges itself to accommodate cargo that exists outside the normal flow of time. The pharmaceutical company paid me a bonus for maintaining perfect temperature control, but they've never called me for another run. Sometimes I wonder if Ivan is even my real name, or if I'm just another echo from a driver who counted down to 0 years ago, still delivering the same impossible load through a reality that reshapes itself with each completed route. I've stopped at the same pilot station 14 times in the past month, but according to the security footage, I've been coming here for 47 years. The clerk keeps asking why I never age while everyone else around me grows old and dies. Military training taught me to keep precise records of everything: fuel receipts, mileage logs, maintenance schedules, route documentation. After my discharge from the Army in 1998, I brought that same discipline to trucking. 27 years on the road, and my logbooks were works of art, detailed down to the minute and mile. I'm Hayden, and I haul timber products through the Pacific Northwest in a forest green Peterbilt 379 that's been my home longer than any house I ever lived in. What I'm about to tell you happened over the course of what I thought was 6 months in 2014. But I've come to understand that time doesn't work the way we think it does when you're caught in a loop that spans decades. It started with a simple fuel stop routine that I'd performed thousands of times before. Every Tuesday and Friday, I'd hit the same Chevron station outside Olympia, Washington, to fuel up before heading into the timber country. The station sat at the intersection of Highway 101 and a logging road that wound deep into the Olympic Peninsula, surrounded by Douglas firs that had been standing since before my grandfather was born. The place had character, an older building with that distinctive red and blue signage, run by a family that had owned it for generations. Martha worked the day shift, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a memory for every regular customer's usual order. Black coffee and a ham sandwich for me, every Tuesday and Friday, same routine. The first sign something was wrong came when Martha started looking confused every time I walked in. She'd stare at me for a long moment, then shake her head and mutter something about how I looked exactly like her father used to describe a driver who came through in the 1970s. I laughed it off. People say I have one of those faces, and truckers have been using the same routes for decades. But then she showed me a photograph from behind the counter, a faded color picture from 1977, showing a timber hauler filling up at pump number 3. The truck was different, an old Kenworth conventional, but the driver looked exactly like me. Same face, same build, same forest green uniform shirt. I started paying closer attention to things after that. My fuel receipts all showed the same date, March 15th, 2014. But I was buying fuel every Tuesday and Friday like clockwork. When I looked at the receipt timestamps, they showed I'd been at that station at 2:47 p.m. on March 15th more than 30 times. I pulled out my logbook and compared the entries. Every fuel stop was recorded on a different day, spanning from February through July 2014. But all the receipts insisted it was the same day, the same time, the same transaction repeated over and over. That's when I decided to test something. I brought a notebook specifically for tracking my stops at that station, keeping it separate from my official logs. Every time I fueled up, I'd write down what Martha was wearing, what she said to me, any other customers in the store, the condition of the weather outside. After 10 visits, the pattern became clear and terrifying. Martha wore the same blue cardigan every time, said the exact same words in the exact same order. And there was always a red pickup truck at Pump 2 with Washington plates reading TBR 4471. The weather was always overcast, but not raining. The temperature always exactly 52 degrees. And the same news report played on the radio about a logging accident that had happened that morning. I started experimenting with the loop. I'd try different pumps, buy different items, skip the coffee and sandwich. But no matter what I did, the receipt always showed Pump 3, black coffee, ham sandwich, March 15th, 2:47 p.m. I'd watch the security cameras while I was inside, and they showed me going through the exact same motions every time, even when I was consciously trying to do something different. It was like my body was following a script I couldn't deviate from, while my mind remained aware of the repetition. The breakthrough came when I decided to stay at the station longer than usual. Instead of leaving immediately after fueling up, I parked in the lot and watched. At exactly 3:15 p.m., something extraordinary happened. The station shimmered like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, and for just a moment, I could see multiple versions of it overlapping. There was the 2014 version I'd been experiencing, but underneath it were layers of other time periods. I saw the station as it had been in the 1980s with different signage, the 1970s with older pumps, even back to the 1950s when it was just a small building with 2 pumps and a hand crank register. During that shimmer, I could see other versions of myself. There was the 1977 version Martha had shown me in the photograph, driving that old Kenworth. But there were others too. A 1983 version in a different truck, a 1991 version, a 2001 version, all of us following the same route, stopping at the same station, buying the same fuel and food, trapped in our own individual loops, but all occurring simultaneously in the same location. The station existed as a temporal intersection where all our timelines converged every Tuesday and Friday at 2:47 p.m. I tried leaving the area entirely, taking different routes through different states. But no matter where I went or what loads I hauled, I always found myself back at that station on Tuesday and Friday afternoons. The GPS would glitch, showing roads that led back to Olympia even when I was driving in the opposite direction. My fuel gauge would drop to empty regardless of when I'd last filled up, forcing me to stop at the only station that would accept my fuel card. The same chevron at the intersection of Highway 101 and the logging road. The most disturbing discovery came when I managed to access the station's security footage from different years. The owner's son, a tech-savvy kid in his 20s, helped me review recordings going back decades after I convinced him something strange was happening. The footage showed version after version of myself, in different trucks from different eras, but always performing the same actions. In 1977, I drove the Kenworth. In 1983, it was a blue Freightliner. In 1991, a red Mack. The trucks changed, but I remained exactly the same age, wearing the same face, going through the same routine. But the footage revealed something even more unsettling. With each iteration, the world around the station was slowly changing. Businesses across the street appeared and disappeared. The forest grew thicker in some versions, thinner in others. Roads shifted their paths slightly. It was as if my repeated presence was causing reality to flux, creating small alterations that accumulated over decades. The station remained constant, but everything else gradually morphed with each cycle. I started noticing the changes in real time during my visits. Martha aged slightly between my stops, but always reset to the same approximate age during the shimmer at 3:15. Other customers appeared and disappeared, sometimes the same people but living different lives, making different choices. The red pickup at Pump 2 belonged to different people in different iterations. Sometimes a logger, sometimes a fisherman, sometimes a woman heading to Seattle for a job interview she'd either get or lose, depending on which version of reality I was experiencing. The worst part was realizing that my presence was affecting other people's lives. In some iterations, Martha's father had lived longer because a trucker, me, had stopped to help him change a tire in 1977. In others, he'd died younger because that same trucker had been delayed and wasn't there when he needed help. My repeated loops through time were creating ripple effects, spawning alternate timelines where the same people lived different lives based on tiny variations in our interactions. I've been trying to break the cycle for what feels like years now, but my logbook insists it's still 2014. I've memorized every detail of that fuel stop, every word Martha says, every crack in the pavement around Pump 3. I know that if I could just do something different enough, something significant enough to break the pattern, I might escape. But the station has rules, and those rules seem to override my free will every Tuesday and Friday at 2:47 p.m. Sometimes I catch glimpses of other drivers who've been caught in similar loops at different stations along different routes. We see each other during the shimmer moments, trapped in our own repetitive cycles, hauling the same loads through the same temporal intersections over and over again. We're all part of something larger, a network of looped time that keeps the trucking industry running even when individual drivers get lost in the gaps between minutes, delivering the same cargo across decades while the world changes around us. The fuel gauge is reading empty again, and it's Tuesday. In 17 minutes, I'll be pulling up to Pump 3 at that Chevron station outside Olympia, buying black coffee and a ham sandwich from Martha, who will look at me with confused recognition and wonder why I never age. And maybe this time, just maybe, I'll figure out how to break free from March 15th, 2014, and drive my way back into linear time where Tuesday is followed by Wednesday instead of another Tuesday, forever and always, until time itself runs out of fuel. When I woke up in that Missouri rest area, my trailer was completely empty, but my bank account showed payment for deliveries I never made. The GPS log revealed I'd somehow driven through 17 states in 8 hours, stopping at addresses that don't exist in towns that were destroyed decades ago. I've always prided myself on being the most detail-oriented driver on the road. Every mile tracked, every fuel stop documented, every delivery recorded with photographic evidence. My name is Stetson, and I run a custom tracking system that would make NASA jealous. GPS with real-time logging, dash cameras with night vision, electronic logs that sync to 3 different backup servers, and a personal logbook written in my own handwriting that I've maintained for 8 years without missing a single entry. I thought technology could protect me from the uncertainties of life on the road. I was wrong. Some deliveries happen outside the boundaries of what any tracking system can monitor, in places that exist only when certain cargo needs to find its way home. The load pickup seemed routine enough. A high-priority electronics shipment from a warehouse in Portland, Oregon, bound for multiple delivery points across the eastern seaboard. The manifest listed 12 stops from Virginia to Maine, all legitimate businesses I'd delivered to before. The cargo was sealed pallets of computer equipment, servers, networking hardware, specialized electronics for government contractors. Standard stuff, except for the unusual payment structure. Instead of the normal rate per mile, this job paid a flat fee of $50,000, with half up front and half on completion. The dispatcher, a woman I'd never spoken to before, emphasized that all deliveries had to be completed within 72 hours, and under no circumstances should I open the trailer or inspect the cargo. I loaded up my 2019 Freightliner Cascadia and hit the road just after midnight on a Tuesday in October 2019. The first few hours were completely normal. I documented everything as usual: fuel stops, rest breaks, mileage at each state line. My dash cam recorded clear footage of the highway, my GPS showed steady progress eastward on I-84, and my electronic logs displayed perfect compliance with hours of service regulations. At 6:30 a.m., I stopped at a truck stop outside Boise for fuel and a quick inspection. The trailer doors were still sealed, the cargo showed no signs of shifting, and all my tracking systems showed normal readings. That's the last thing I remember clearly. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my sleeper berth at a rest area on I-70 in Missouri, and it was Thursday morning. According to my dashboard clock, I'd been unconscious for nearly 40 hours. My first instinct was panic. Missing time meant missed deliveries, and missed deliveries meant ruined reputation and lost income. But when I checked my electronic logs, they showed I'd been driving continuously for the past 2 days, maintaining perfect legal status with all required rest breaks properly documented. The GPS showed a route that should have been impossible. I'd somehow driven from Oregon to Missouri, then up to Michigan, down to Florida, back up to New York, and across to Pennsylvania before ending up in Missouri. Over 6,000 miles in 40 hours, averaging speeds that would have required me to drive at 150 mph constantly without stopping. I grabbed my phone to call dispatch and discovered 17 voicemails from satisfied customers, all thanking me for on-time deliveries and professional service. Each message referenced specific interactions, conversations I didn't remember having, delivery times I couldn't have met, even compliments about my unusual but efficient delivery methods. Mrs. Chen from the electronics company in Richmond said I delivered at exactly 3:47 a.m. Wednesday, and she appreciated how I'd somehow unloaded the entire pallet without waking anyone in the building. Mr. Rodriguez from the data center in Buffalo mentioned that I delivered during their closed hours on Tuesday night. But the cargo was perfectly staged in their loading dock when they arrived Wednesday morning. The dash cam footage was even more disturbing. 40 hours of recording showed me driving continuously, but the person behind the wheel wasn't acting like me. This other version of myself drove with mechanical precision, never adjusting the radio, never drinking coffee, never showing any signs of fatigue or human behavior. The facial expressions were blank, the movements robotic. Worse, the footage showed me making deliveries at locations that looked nothing like the addresses on my manifest. Instead of modern business parks and office buildings, I was delivering to dilapidated warehouses, abandoned industrial complexes, and structures that appeared to be partially demolished. I pulled out my paper atlas and tried to plot the route shown on my GPS log. The addresses led to some disturbing discoveries. The Richmond delivery was made to a building that had burned down in 1987. The Buffalo location was in an area that had been flooded and evacuated in 2003. The Miami stop was at coordinates that placed it in the middle of Biscayne Bay, underwater. Yet somehow, I'd made successful deliveries to all these impossible locations, and my customers were completely satisfied with the service. The bank records confirmed payment for all 12 deliveries, but the payment amounts were wrong. Instead of the agreed-upon $50,000 total, I'd received payments ranging from $847.50 to $12,233.78. Seemingly random amounts that together totaled exactly $127,641. When I called the bank to inquire about the deposits, they showed originating accounts from companies that had been dissolved years ago, some dating back to the 1990s. The bank representative was puzzled but confirmed that all payments had cleared and were legitimate transactions. I drove to the nearest truck stop and called the dispatch number from my original paperwork. The woman who answered had no record of my load, no knowledge of the Portland pickup, and insisted that their company had never operated in Oregon. When I provided the confirmation numbers and documentation, she became increasingly agitated and finally hung up. I tried calling the customers who had left voicemails, but half the phone numbers were disconnected, and the other half connected to people who claimed they'd never heard of me or received any deliveries. That's when I noticed my trailer was completely empty, but the seals were intact. The same security seals that had been attached in Portland were still in place, unbroken. Yet the trailer contained nothing but empty pallets and tie-down straps arranged as if cargo had been properly unloaded. I took photographs of everything: the empty trailer, the intact seals, the delivery confirmations on my phone. But when I reviewed the photos later, they showed different images. The trailer appeared fully loaded in some shots, partially loaded in others. And in one disturbing image, it contained cargo that looked nothing like electronics. Old furniture, vintage clothing, and what appeared to be personal belongings from different decades. I started researching the delivery addresses more thoroughly, using online archives and historical records. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. Every location on my manifest corresponded to businesses that had existed at some point in the past. But all had been destroyed by fires, floods, earthquakes, or economic collapse. The electronics equipment I'd supposedly delivered matched inventory lists from these defunct companies. Computers and networking gear they would have needed when they were still operating, decades before I was even born. The most disturbing discovery came when I cross-referenced the customer names with obituaries and missing person reports. Mrs. Chen from Richmond had died in the fire that destroyed her building in 1987. Mr. Rodriguez from Buffalo had been reported missing after the flood in 2003. Every person who had called to thank me for my deliveries had been dead for years, yet their voices on my voicemail were clear, contemporary, and grateful for services I had somehow provided to them across the boundaries of death. I've continued driving since then, but I've learned to be afraid of certain loads. High-paying jobs with unusual requirements, cargo that's pre-sealed, and especially deliveries to addresses that seem just slightly off when I look them up. Because I've come to understand that some freight doesn't move through space, it moves through time. And sometimes, drivers like me become unwitting couriers between the world of the living and the world of the dead, delivering goods that were never received because the recipients died before their orders could arrive. My tracking systems still work perfectly for normal loads, but they can't monitor deliveries that happen in the spaces between seconds, in the moments when reality bends to accommodate cargo that exists in multiple timelines simultaneously. I've tried to refuse these supernatural runs, but they always find me, eventually. The phone will ring with a dispatcher I don't recognize, offering payment I can't afford to refuse, for deliveries that need to be made to customers who have been waiting longer than I've been alive. The most terrifying part is that I'm good at it. Whatever force takes control of me during these impossible runs is more efficient than I could ever be on my own. It knows routes that don't appear on any map, delivers to locations that exist only when the cargo arrives, and satisfies customers whose needs transcend the normal boundaries of commerce and mortality. I've become part of a delivery network that spans decades, connecting the unfinished business of the dead with the continuing operations of the living world. Sometimes I wonder if Stetson is even my real name, or if I'm just another piece of cargo being delivered through time, carrying memories and identity from some other driver who accepted the wrong load and never made it back to his own timeline. But the payments keep coming, and the deliveries keep getting made, and somewhere in the space between life and death, there are customers still waiting for electronics that will help them complete projects they'll never finish in buildings that will never be rebuilt. The accident happened so fast, I didn't even realize I was dead until I tried to radio for help, and my voice came through the CB as static. Now I watch helplessly as my truck continues making deliveries, while my body lies in a morgue 3 states away. And somehow the delivery receipts are still being signed in my own handwriting. My name is Jude, and for 30 years, I drove the same 2018 Peterbilt 389 across the country, a midnight blue beauty with chrome stacks and custom paint that made her stand out at every truck stop from California to Maine. She wasn't just my truck. She was my home, my office, my sanctuary, and my legacy. I'd planned to pass her down to my son Marcus when I retired, teach him everything I knew about life on the road, about treating your equipment right and respecting the highways that fed our family. Instead, on a snowy March morning in 2020, on a remote stretch of Highway 287 in Wyoming, everything changed in the span of 3 seconds when a sudden whiteout turned the world white and sent my rig sliding sideways into a bridge abutment at 70 miles per hour. The impact should have been the end of everything. I remember the moment of collision, the terrible sound of metal crushing and glass exploding, the sensation of weightlessness as the cab rolled, and my body was thrown against forces no human spine could withstand. There was pain, brief and absolute, followed by a strange floating sensation, and then nothing. When awareness returned, I was standing beside the wreckage in the snow, looking down at my own body slumped over the steering wheel, blood pooling on the dashboard I'd polished just that morning. The strangest part wasn't seeing myself dead. It was realizing that my truck's engine was still running, the diesel rumbling with the same steady rhythm it had maintained for over 800,000 miles. I tried to flag down the first responders when they arrived, tried to tell them about the load I was carrying, about the delivery schedule I needed to maintain, about how my dispatcher needed to be notified. But my voice produced no sound. My gestures went unnoticed. And I watched helplessly as they loaded my body into an ambulance and had my truck towed to the nearest impound yard. That's when I learned the first rule of being a dead trucker. Your physical death doesn't necessarily end your obligations to the road, especially when you've got freight that needs delivered and a truck that's been your partner for 3 decades. The impound yard should have been the end of my truck story. Totaled vehicles get sold for scrap, their useful parts harvested, and their remains crushed into cubes of recycled metal. But when I followed the tow truck to the yard, I discovered something impossible. My Peterbilt sat in the lot, looking exactly as it had before the accident. No damage, no bent chrome, no shattered windshield. The blue paint gleamed under the security lights, as if I'd just finished detailing it. When the yard supervisor checked his paperwork the next morning, the documentation showed a truck that had been brought in for routine maintenance, not accident recovery. I watched in amazement as my truck fired up on its own the next morning and drove out of the lot, somehow bypassing the locked gates and security systems without triggering any alarms. The GPS tracker that my company used for fleet management showed the truck back en route. They said maintaining perfect speed and following the delivery schedule I'd planned before the accident. But there was no driver visible in the cab, just an empty seat where I should have been sitting. Other drivers on the highway later reported seeing me behind the wheel, waving from my driver's seat as I passed them on the interstate. But security cameras at truck stops and weigh stations showed my truck operating itself, parking with mechanical precision and following all DOT regulations without human intervention. The first delivery happened exactly on schedule. I followed my own truck to a distribution center outside Denver, where I watched it back up to the loading dock with the same careful technique I'd perfected over 30 years of driving. The dock workers unloaded the freight, automotive parts bound for an assembly plant, and one of them even commented to his partner about how professional the driver had been, how he'd positioned the trailer perfectly without needing any guidance. But there was no driver. The delivery receipt was signed Jude in handwriting that matched my own signature perfectly, even though I was standing 10 feet away as an invisible ghost, unable to touch the clipboard or hold the pen. Over the following weeks, I followed my truck as it continued operating my route with supernatural efficiency. It made every pickup and delivery on time, maintained perfect logbook records that somehow appeared in my own handwriting, and even stopped at my favorite truck stops for fuel and mandatory rest breaks. Other drivers began talking about me on the CB radio, sharing stories about conversations they'd had with me at fuel pumps and in parking lots. They described detailed discussions about load securement techniques, weather conditions, and route planning. Conversations that I had no memory of having because I wasn't actually present for them, at least not in any way that I could understand. The most disturbing part was watching my truck interact with my family. My son Marcus received phone calls from my number, conversations where my voice discussed trucking business, shared driving advice, and talked about plans for him to join me on runs. My wife got regular calls where I told her about my trips, described the scenery I was seeing, and reassured her about my safety on the road. But during these calls, I was standing in our kitchen watching her side of the conversation, unable to communicate that I was right there, but also somehow simultaneously driving my truck hundreds of miles away. The company I worked for never questioned my continued productivity. My truck kept generating revenue, maintained its excellent safety record, and received commendations for on-time performance. My paychecks were deposited electronically into the same bank account I'd used for 30 years. And my wife continued receiving the income that supported our household. The only people who knew I had died were the coroner who examined my body and the state trooper who wrote the accident report. Documents that somehow got lost in bureaucratic shuffles and computer system errors. I began to realize that my death had created a paradox. My physical body had died in that Wyoming accident. But my identity as a trucker, my relationship with my truck, and my commitment to completing every delivery had somehow survived independently. My Peterbilt had become a vessel carrying not just freight, but the essential part of who I was that couldn't accept leaving a job unfinished. The truck operated with the accumulated knowledge of 30 years of driving experience. Following routes I'd memorized, making decisions I would have made, maintaining standards I'd established over decades of professional trucking. The supernatural deliveries became increasingly complex as my truck began accepting loads that no living driver would have been able to handle. Freight that needed to be delivered to locations that existed only at certain times of day, cargo that required routes through areas that weren't marked on any map, and shipments bound for customers who could only be reached by drivers who weren't bound by the normal limitations of physical existence. My truck became part of a network of phantom freight operations, hauling goods between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond, serving markets that operated outside normal commercial channels. Other ghost truckers began flagging me down during these supernatural runs, drivers who had died in accidents, but whose trucks continued operating on similar missions. We formed an informal convoy of the deceased, sharing information about otherworldly routes and comparing notes about customers who placed orders from beyond the grave. I learned that the trucking industry has always included a supernatural component. Freight that moves between dimensions, cargo that exists in multiple timelines simultaneously, and deliveries that can only be completed by drivers who are no longer constrained by physical limitations. The strangest revelation came when I discovered that my accident in Wyoming had been orchestrated. The sudden whiteout, the icy conditions, even the timing of other traffic on that remote highway had been arranged to create the precise circumstances needed for my transformation from living driver to supernatural courier. My truck had been selected years earlier to become part of this ghost fleet, and my death was simply the final step in a recruitment process that I'd been unknowingly participating in throughout my entire career. My son Marcus eventually joined me, though not in the way I'd originally planned. He started having dreams about driving my truck, about routes that led through landscapes that existed only in the spaces between sleeping and waking. In these dreams, I was able to teach him about the supernatural side of trucking, about freight that connects the living world with whatever comes after, about the responsibility that drivers carry even beyond death. He learned to hear my voice on frequencies that living radios can't receive, and to see my truck even when it was invisible to everyone else. Now I understand that some careers don't end with death. They just transition into different forms of service. My truck continues making deliveries across dimensions I never knew existed while I was alive, hauling cargo between the world of the living and the infinite highways that stretch beyond physical existence. Every mile logged, every delivery completed, every satisfied customer adds to a record that will outlast any mortal career, because the road itself never ends, and neither do the drivers who truly belong to it. The blue Peterbilt still runs strong, maintained by supernatural forces that keep the diesel flowing and the chrome polished. And somewhere in the cab, the ghost of a driver named Jude continues doing what he's always done, keeping America moving, one delivery at a time, even from beyond the grave. The DOT inspector at that isolated scale house knew things about me that I'd never told another living soul. Sins I'd buried so deep, I'd almost convinced myself they never happened. When he started loading invisible weight onto my truck for each transgression, I realized some scales don't just measure cargo. They weigh the darkness in a man's heart. I used to be a pastor before I became a trucker, back when I believed God's forgiveness could wash away any sin and that redemption was available to anyone who truly sought it. My name is Legend, and I spent 15 years behind a pulpit in a small Texas town, preaching about salvation and second chances to congregations who trusted me to guide their spiritual lives. That ended on a rainy Thursday night in 2009, when my car ran a red light and slammed into a family of 4 who were simply trying to get home from their daughter's school play. 2 children died instantly. The mother lingered for 3 days in intensive care before joining them, and the father survived with injuries that would never fully heal. I walked away from the accident with nothing more than cuts and bruises. But the weight of what I'd done crushed something inside me that no amount of prayer could repair. The official investigation ruled it an accident caused by wet roads and poor visibility, but I knew the truth. I'd been drinking that night. Not heavily, but enough to slow my reflexes, enough to make me misjudge the timing of that traffic light. I'd been drinking because I'd discovered my wife was having an affair with the church treasurer, and instead of handling it with the wisdom and grace I preached about every Sunday, I'd chosen to numb the pain with whiskey. 3 people died because I couldn't practice what I preached, because I was too weak to face my problems without chemical assistance, because I was human in all the worst ways while pretending to be something better from behind my pulpit. I resigned from the ministry the day after the funeral, claiming I needed time for personal reflection and spiritual renewal. The congregation was understanding, supportive even, talking about how the trauma of witnessing such a terrible accident had affected their beloved pastor. They never knew I was running from guilt, not grief. I sold everything I owned, bought a used Kenworth with a sleeper cab, and got my CDL with the idea that life on the road would help me outrun the memories. For 7 years, it worked. The constant movement, the ever-changing scenery, the simple mechanical demands of hauling freight from point A to point B, it all helped me forget what I'd done, helped me build a new identity as Legend the Trucker instead of Pastor Samuel Wright, the man who killed a family and got away with it. But the road has a way of bringing you face to face with things you'd rather forget. And mine came in the form of an isolated DOT scale house on Route 287 in Texas, about 40 miles from where that accident had happened 7 years earlier. I'd driven past the facility hundreds of times during my trucking career. A simple concrete building with electronic scales and inspection bays where Department of Transportation officers checked for equipment violations and logbook compliance. It was routine, mundane, the kind of bureaucratic checkpoint that every trucker encounters multiple times per month. Except on this particular morning in March 2016, the inspector waiting for me knew things that no DOT officer should have been able to know. I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Oklahoma to Houston, running about an hour ahead of schedule when the electronic signs directed me onto the scales. Standard procedure called for checking my weight, reviewing my logbooks, and maybe a quick inspection of my equipment if the officer was being thorough. Instead, the inspector, a thin man in his 50s with gray hair and eyes that seemed older than his face, looked at my license and registration, then asked me to step inside the scale house for what he called a more comprehensive review. The interior of the building was standard government office decor. Fluorescent lighting, metal desks, filing cabinets, and walls lined with DOT regulations and safety posters. But something felt wrong the moment I walked inside. The inspector's nameplate read Officer Morrison, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that went beyond traffic enforcement. He asked me to have a seat while he reviewed my documentation, then began asking questions that had nothing to do with trucking regulations or equipment compliance. "Tell me about the night of October 15th, 2009, he said. not looking up from a file folder that seemed far too thick for a routine DOT inspection. Specifically, tell me about what you were doing between 8:30 and 9:15 p.m. The question hit me like a physical blow. October 15th, 2009 was the night of the accident. The night I killed the Henderson family and destroyed my own soul in the process. There was no reason for a DOT inspector to know that date. No connection between a 7-year-old car accident and a routine truck inspection. I tried to deflect, claiming I didn't remember that specific date. But Officer Morrison opened the file and began reading details that made my blood run cold. He knew about the rain, about the intersection where it happened, about my speed at the moment of impact. He knew about the whiskey I'd consumed at Murphy's bar, about the argument I'd had with my wife earlier that evening, even about the sermon I'd been preparing for the following Sunday on the topic of personal responsibility and moral accountability. Interesting choice of sermon topics, Morrison said, looking directly at me for the first time. Planning to preach about responsibility while avoiding it in your own life. That's what we call irony, wouldn't you say? His eyes weren't human anymore. They were something else. Something that could see through flesh and bone directly into the parts of me I'd been trying to hide for 7 years. That's when he told me we were going to conduct a different kind of inspection, one that measured more than just the weight of my cargo. He led me back outside to where my truck sat on the electronic scales, but now the display showed impossible readings. Instead of the 78,000 pounds I'd been carrying when I drove onto the scales, the numbers kept climbing. 85,000, 95,000, 110,000 pounds, and rising. Morrison explained that we were measuring the total weight of everything I was carrying, including burdens that weren't visible to normal inspections. Each sin adds weight, he said, consulting a clipboard that appeared to have materialized from nowhere. Each lie, each moment of cowardice, each time you chose personal comfort over moral obligation. The Henderson family, that's significant weight right there. 3 lives lost because you couldn't handle your problems without pharmaceutical assistance. That adds about 15,000 pounds to your load. The scale display jumped accordingly, and I felt my truck sag under invisible pressure. Morrison continued his supernatural audit, listing transgressions I'd committed throughout my life. Some I'd forgotten, and others I'd never admitted even to myself. The time I'd embezzled money from the church building fund to pay gambling debts. The teenage girl I'd counseled who came to me for help with an abusive father, and how I'd convinced her to keep quiet because exposure would hurt the church's reputation. The dozens of people who trusted me for spiritual guidance while I was living a lie, pretending to have answers I didn't possess and offering hope I didn't feel. With each revelation, the weight on my truck increased. The suspension groaned under loads that shouldn't have been physically possible. The tires began to flatten against the asphalt. The frame itself started to bend as Morrison added more and more invisible cargo to account for decades of moral failures and spiritual hypocrisy. I watched helplessly as my truck was crushed by the accumulated weight of everything I'd done wrong, every person I'd failed, every moment I'd chosen selfishness over service. The interesting thing about spiritual weight, Morrison said, is that it can't be reduced by simply changing locations. You've been hauling these burdens for 7 years, thinking that constant movement would help you escape them. But they've been growing heavier with each mile you've driven. Each day you've avoided taking responsibility for what you've done. The scale display now showed over 200,000 pounds, and my truck was visibly sinking into the asphalt. Morrison handed me a citation, but instead of a normal DOT violation, it was a bill of lading for cargo I'd been carrying without proper documentation. The manifest listed every sin, every failure, every moment of moral cowardice that had accumulated over my lifetime. At the bottom, in official DOT language, it stated that I was operating an overweight vehicle and would need to reduce my load before being allowed to continue. "How do I unload this cargo?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer would require facing things I'd spent years avoiding. Morrison smiled for the first time, and for a moment his inhuman eyes showed something that might have been compassion. "Same way you would handle any overweight situation. You find the appropriate facility and unload what you can't legally carry. In your case, that means going back to where you picked up this particular load and making some deliveries you should have made years ago." The Henderson family grave site was 40 miles away. I'd driven past the cemetery hundreds of times, but never stopped. Never acknowledged what lay beneath those headstones, never faced the people whose lives I'd ended. Morrison's scale house had given me a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. I could continue carrying impossible weight until it destroyed me and everyone around me. Or I could finally make the delivery that I'd been avoiding for 7 years. My truck barely moved as I left the scale house, groaning under spiritual weight that made every mile a struggle. But as I drove toward the cemetery where 3 graves waited for an apology that was 7 years overdue, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that rainy October night. Not forgiveness, that would take much longer to earn, but the possibility that some burdens could eventually be set down, that some loads could finally be delivered to their proper destination, and that redemption might be available even to drivers who had been carrying the weight of the dead for far too long. The CB crackled to life at 11:47 p.m. with an invitation to join a trucker convoy protest on I-75. But when I saw the other drivers' faces in my mirrors, I realized they were all heading to appointments with death. Each truck in the formation represented a different way to die, and I was being recruited as the final casualty in a supernatural funeral procession that had been driving the same route for decades. My name is Matthias, and at 24 years old, I was the youngest independent owner-operator in my hometown of Valdosta, Georgia. I'd saved every penny from 3 years of driving for other companies to buy my own rig, a cherry-red Peterbilt 379 with enough chrome to blind oncoming traffic, and a sound system that could wake the dead. I was young, idealistic, and absolutely convinced that truckers were the backbone of America. The last free cowboys in a world that had forgotten what independence really meant. When the CB radio started buzzing about a convoy forming up to protest new regulations that would put small operators like me out of business, I didn't hesitate to join what I thought was a stand for trucker rights and freedom. It was a humid August night in 2021, and I was deadheading home from a delivery in Jacksonville when the call came through on Channel 19. The voice was gravelly, professional, with the kind of authority that comes from decades behind the wheel. He identified himself as Big Rig Moses and explained that independent truckers were forming a convoy to drive through Atlanta and make their voices heard about regulations that favored large carriers over small operators. The meeting point was the truck stop at exit 156, and the plan was to form up just after midnight for a coordinated run through the metro area during the early morning hours when we'd get maximum visibility without disrupting too much regular traffic. I pulled into the truck stop around 11:30 p.m. and immediately saw other drivers preparing for the convoy. There were maybe 15 trucks already staged in the lot, a mix of different makes and models that represented the diversity of independent trucking. I parked near the back and walked over to introduce myself, eager to meet fellow drivers who shared my passion for the freedom of the road. But something felt wrong the moment I started talking to the other participants. Their conversations were off somehow, focused on topics that didn't quite make sense and peppered with references to trucking regulations and industry conditions from decades past. The driver of a faded blue Kenworth introduced himself as Danny and started talking about how the new electronic logging devices were going to destroy the industry. When I mentioned that ELDs had been mandatory for years already, he looked confused and insisted that the regulations were still being debated in Congress. A woman driving an immaculate white Freightliner complained about fuel prices hitting 90 cents per gallon, which hadn't been accurate since the 1990s. Every conversation I had with other convoy participants revealed similar disconnects, as if they were all living in different time periods and unaware of how much the industry had changed. Big Rig Moses finally made his appearance around midnight, climbing down from a massive black Peterbilt that looked like it had been custom-built for intimidation rather than efficiency. He was a mountain of a man, with a gray beard and eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When he spoke, every other driver fell silent and listened with the kind of respect usually reserved for religious leaders or legendary figures. He outlined the route we'd take through Atlanta, emphasizing the importance of maintaining formation and staying together no matter what happened during the run. This convoy represents something bigger than just protesting regulations, he said, his voice carrying across the parking lot without any effort to project. We're making a statement about what it means to be a trucker, about the sacrifices we make to keep America moving, and about the price we pay for choosing this life. Every driver here has made that commitment, and tonight we're going to honor that sacrifice by completing a run that will be remembered forever. The formation lined up just after midnight, with Big Rig Moses leading in his black Peterbilt, and the rest of us spaced about a quarter-mile apart to maintain proper convoy protocol. I was positioned near the rear of the formation, which gave me a good view of the other trucks as we rolled north on I-75 toward Atlanta. That's when I started noticing details that should have terrified me immediately, but somehow seemed normal in the moment. The truck directly ahead of me was a red Mack that appeared to be on fire, flames licking along the trailer walls and smoke pouring from the engine compartment. But the driver maintained perfect speed and spacing as if nothing was wrong. 2 trucks ahead of the burning Mack was a white Freightliner that seemed to be dissolving, its paint fading to transparency and its chrome becoming ghostly and insubstantial. I could see the highway through the truck's trailer as if it was becoming invisible while still maintaining its position in the convoy. Further up the line, a yellow Peterbilt was covered in what looked like ice, icicles hanging from every surface despite the August heat, while the truck next to it appeared to be rusting in real time, metal flaking away and leaving gaps in the cabin trailer walls. The CB radio chatter during the convoy was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Drivers were describing road conditions from different decades, talking about traffic patterns that hadn't existed since the 1980s, and referencing landmarks that had been demolished years ago. Big Rig Moses kept the formation organized with commands that sounded more like military orders than convoy coordination, directing us through lane changes and exit strategies with supernatural precision. When we passed through Atlanta, I realized we weren't driving through the city as it existed in 2021. We were traveling through multiple versions of Atlanta from different time periods, with buildings appearing and disappearing as we moved through the metropolitan area. That's when I understood what was really happening. This wasn't a protest convoy. It was a funeral procession. Each truck in the formation represented a different way that truckers die on the road. The burning Mack was carrying a driver who had died in a truck fire. The dissolving Freightliner represented someone who had simply vanished without a trace. The ice-covered Peterbilt belonged to a driver who had frozen to death during a blizzard. And the rusting truck carried someone who had been forgotten by the industry and left to decay in an abandoned truck stop. We were all dead or dying, driving through a version of reality that existed only for drivers who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their commitment to the road. I tried to break formation, to exit the convoy and return to the world of the living. but my truck wouldn't respond to my steering inputs. Big Rig Moses's voice came through the CB with supernatural authority, explaining that I had been selected to complete the convoy because my story represented the final type of trucker death. The young driver who dies from his own idealism, who believes so strongly in the romance of trucking that he drives himself into situations no reasonable person would survive. My death would complete the procession, representing every category of trucker mortality in a single supernatural convoy that drove the same route through Atlanta every few years, recruiting new members to replace those who had finally found peace. The revelation should have terrified me, but instead I felt a strange sense of belonging and purpose. These were my people, drivers who had given everything for the lifestyle I loved, who had died doing what they believed in, rather than compromising their principles for safety or security. The convoy represented the ultimate expression of trucker solidarity, a brotherhood that extended beyond life and death, connecting drivers across decades of history who had all made the same choice to prioritize freedom and independence over longevity and stability. As we completed our run through Atlanta and headed back south on I-75, I began to understand the true nature of the supernatural convoy. We were a reminder, a testament to the costs of choosing the trucking life, and a warning to young drivers who might be tempted to romanticize an industry that demands everything from its participants. Every few years, when conditions were right and the right combination of atmospheric pressure and spiritual energy aligned, we materialized to collect one more member and complete another circuit through the routes where we had all once lived and worked. My truck began to change as we approached the end of the convoy route, taking on the characteristics that would represent my particular type of death. The chrome started to tarnish, the paint began to fade, and the engine developed the kind of knock that indicates terminal mechanical failure. I was becoming the truck that represented young drivers who burn out from trying too hard, who push themselves and their equipment beyond sustainable limits in pursuit of an ideal that exists more in imagination than reality. Big Rig Moses radioed final instructions as we prepared to dissolve back into whatever dimension the convoy inhabited between manifestations. My job now was to wait for the next recruitment opportunity, to help identify the next young idealistic driver who needed to complete our supernatural formation. The convoy of the condemned would continue its eternal circuit through the highways of the Southeast, carrying the spirits of drivers who had given their lives for the freedom of the road, reminding the living that some prices are higher than others, and that the trucker lifestyle demands sacrifices that go far beyond the obvious dangers of equipment failure and traffic accidents. When dawn broke over the Georgia countryside, I was still driving. But I was no longer part of the world I had known. I had joined something larger and more permanent than any earthly protest convoy. A supernatural brotherhood of drivers who had chosen principle over survival, and who would continue driving the eternal highways long after the last truck stop closed, and the final mile of interstate crumbled back into the earth. My dispatcher started routing me around accidents that hadn't happened yet, guiding me through detours for road closures that wouldn't occur for another 6 hours. What I didn't realize until it was too late was that every disaster I avoided was claiming the life of another trucker who took the route I was supposed to travel. I've always followed dispatch orders to the letter. 15 years of driving for Midwest Freight Solutions without a single violation, accident, or late delivery on my record. My name is Callum, and I built my reputation on being the most reliable driver in the fleet. The guy dispatch could count on to handle any load, any route, any deadline without question or complaint. I drove a white 2017 Freightliner Cascadia with satellite communication that kept me connected to the home office 24/7, receiving route updates, load modifications, and schedule changes in real time. That technology was supposed to make trucking safer and more efficient. But in my case, it connected me to something that existed outside normal time. A dispatch center that operated from a future I was never meant to see. The strange instructions started in October 2017 during what should have been a routine run from Chicago to Memphis, hauling automotive parts. I was about 3 hours south of Chicago when my satellite unit chimed with a message from dispatch. Take exit 126 immediately. Proceed west on Route 18 for 40 miles, then rejoin I-55 south. The detour made no sense. It would add nearly 2 hours to my trip and take me through rural areas with no logical reason for the route change. When I radioed dispatch to confirm the instructions, the voice that responded wasn't my usual dispatcher, Janet, but a woman I didn't recognize who insisted that I-55 was closed due to a multi-vehicle accident and would remain impassable for several hours. I followed the detour instructions, though I grumbled about the lost time and fuel costs. The rural highways were empty except for farm traffic, and I saw no signs of any emergency vehicles or accident cleanup that would justify closing a major interstate. When I rejoined I-55 2 hours later, traffic was flowing normally and there was no evidence of any accident or road closure. I radioed dispatch again to complain about the unnecessary detour, but Janet was back on duty and had no record of any route changes or accident reports. According to her system, I'd been on I-55 the entire time, maintaining normal speed and making good progress toward my delivery. That might have been the end of it, except for what I heard on the evening news that night. A massive pileup had occurred on I-55 at exactly the spot where I would have been traveling if I'd maintained my original route. A sudden fog bank had reduced visibility to 0, causing a chain reaction collision involving 17 vehicles, including 3 tractor trailers. 2 people had died, including a truck driver named Marcus Thompson, who was hauling automotive parts for the same company I worked for. The accident happened at 2:47 p.m., precisely when I would have been passing through that location if I hadn't been diverted by the mysterious dispatch instructions. Over the following months, the pattern repeated with increasing frequency. I'd receive sudden route changes, load modifications, or schedule adjustments that seemed illogical or inconvenient. But following them always kept me away from disasters that happened exactly where I would have been traveling. A bridge collapse on Route 64 killed a driver who was hauling my original load after dispatch mysteriously reassigned my freight to him. A truck stop fire in Arkansas claimed 3 lives, including a driver who had taken the parking spot I was originally assigned before receiving last-minute instructions to fuel at a different location. The voice giving me these life-saving instructions was always different from my normal dispatchers. Always a woman I didn't recognize who seemed to have access to information that shouldn't have existed yet. She knew about weather conditions hours before they were forecast, traffic accidents before they were reported, and road closures before the construction crews arrived. When I tried to ask her about her identity or how she obtained advance information about road conditions, she would deflect with professional efficiency and remind me that my job was to follow instructions, not ask questions about dispatch procedures. I started keeping detailed records of every supernatural route change and comparing them to accident reports and news coverage. The pattern was undeniable. Every disaster I avoided claimed the life of another driver who ended up in the location I was supposed to occupy. It was as if the universe maintained some kind of cosmic balance, requiring a certain number of trucking fatalities to occur regardless of individual precautions. My mysterious dispatcher was saving my life by sacrificing others, redirecting death like traffic around a construction zone. The moral implications began eating away at me. I was living while good drivers died, surviving because some supernatural force had decided my life was worth more than theirs. Every successful delivery I made was built on the foundation of another trucker's death. Every safe arrival home to my family paid for with someone else's blood. I tried refusing the strange instructions, ignoring the route changes and load modifications. But when I did, my truck would develop mechanical problems that forced me to stop for repairs at exactly the right time to avoid whatever disaster was waiting ahead. The breakthrough came when I decided to trace the source of the mysterious dispatch instructions. The satellite messages claimed to originate from our normal dispatch center in Columbus, Ohio. But the communication timestamps showed impossible dates. Some messages were stamped with dates from the following year, others from decades in the future. When I contacted the satellite service provider to investigate the anomalous timestamps, they discovered that the messages were being bounced through relay stations that didn't exist yet, broadcast from towers that wouldn't be built for another 20 years. That's when I learned the truth about my supernatural dispatcher. She wasn't operating from a different location. She was operating from a different time. Somehow, communications technology had created a temporal link between my truck in 2017 and a dispatch center that existed in 2047, 30 years in the future. The woman saving my life was working from a world where all the accidents I'd avoided had already become historical records, where the deaths of other truckers were documented facts that could be prevented by rerouting drivers who were still alive in the past. I demanded to speak directly with my future dispatcher, threatening to quit if the company couldn't explain the supernatural instructions I'd been receiving. The response came through the satellite system at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2018. In a voice I recognized as my own daughter Emma, aged from the 7-year-old child I knew into a middle-aged woman I'd never met. "Dad, it's me," the voice said through the truck's communication system. "I know this is hard to understand, but I'm calling from 2047. I work for the same company you do, but 30 years from now. The technology exists to send information backwards through time, and I've been using it to save your life by rerouting you away from accidents that killed truckers in your timeline." Emma explained that in her timeline, I had died in that first accident on I-55 in 2017, leaving her and her mother to struggle financially while she grew up without a father. She'd become a dispatcher herself, partially to understand the industry that had claimed my life. And when the temporal communication technology became available, she'd used it to change the past and save my life. But temporal mechanics required balance. Saving one life meant sacrificing another. And every accident I avoided had to claim a different victim to maintain the stability of the timeline. The revelation that my own daughter was orchestrating the deaths of other truckers to save my life was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. I was living on borrowed time, time stolen from drivers who deserved to go home to their own families. Emma insisted that she was choosing victims carefully, selecting drivers who were alone in the world or whose deaths would cause less collateral damage. But the moral calculus was still monstrous. I told Emma to stop, to let me die as I was supposed to in the original timeline, rather than sacrificing innocent people for my benefit. But she refused, explaining that changing the past again would create paradoxes that could unravel reality itself. I was trapped in a timeline where my survival depended on other people's deaths, where every mile I drove safely was paid for with someone else's blood, where my daughter had become a supernatural serial killer operating from 30 years in the future. The calls continue to this day. Emma still routes me around accidents, still saves my life by sacrificing other truckers, still operates from a dispatch center that exists 3 decades ahead of my current reality. I've tried everything I can think of to break the cycle, changing companies, switching to local routes, even temporarily giving up trucking entirely. but the temporal link follows me wherever I go. My daughter's voice reaches me through whatever communication system I'm using, providing advance warnings about dangers I'm destined to face. I know that someday, probably soon, Emma will make a mistake, or the temporal technology will fail, and I'll finally meet the death I was supposed to face in 2017. When that happens, I hope the other drivers who died in my place will forgive me for accepting a gift I never asked for, paid for with a price I never agreed to pay. Until then, I keep driving, carrying the weight of their deaths along with whatever cargo I'm hauling, knowing that every delivery I complete brings me closer to the moment when the supernatural safety net finally breaks and I join the drivers who died so I could live. I'd been avoiding mirrors since I was 7 years old. Something about reflections always made my skin crawl in ways I could never explain. But that night at the Flying J off I-40 in Oklahoma, I learned that some superstitions exist for very good reasons, especially when the bathroom mirrors start showing you the final moments of every trucker who died on the road. My name is Hayes, and I've been driving for 12 years with what most people would call an unusual phobia. While other truckers spent time in truck stop bathrooms checking their appearance, washing up, or just taking a moment to decompress, I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the floor or the ceiling, doing whatever I could to avoid looking at my own reflection. It started in childhood, after an incident I've never been able to fully explain or forget. Something about seeing things in mirrors that shouldn't have been there. Faces that weren't mine looking back from surfaces that should only show reality. My family thought it was a phase I'd outgrow. But 31 years later, I still feel that same crawling sensation whenever I catch an accidental glimpse of myself in reflective surfaces. Trucking was actually the perfect career for someone with mirror phobia. I could adjust my side mirrors using the reflections of objects around me, focusing on the vehicles and landscape they showed rather than any glimpse of my own face. Truck stop bathrooms were the biggest challenge, but I'd developed a system of keeping my head down, doing my business quickly, and getting out before any accidental eye contact with my own reflection could trigger the anxiety attacks that had plagued me since childhood. For 12 years, this system worked perfectly. I maintained excellent hygiene, stayed professional, and never let other drivers know about the psychological quirk that made me different from everyone else on the road. That changed on a humid October night in 2015 when I was forced to make an emergency stop at a Flying J truck stop outside Oklahoma City. I'd been battling food poisoning for the previous 6 hours, trying to push through to my planned stop in Amarillo. But my body finally overruled my determination and demanded immediate relief. The truck stop was busy for 2 a.m., filled with drivers taking mandatory rest breaks and night shift workers grabbing coffee and snacks. I rushed into the bathroom facility, focused solely on reaching a stall before my digestive system betrayed me completely. The bathroom was larger than most truck stop facilities, with a long row of sinks and mirrors along one wall and individual stalls along the opposite side. Fluorescent lighting gave everything a harsh, clinical appearance that made the white tile walls seem to glow with their own internal light. I made it to a stall just in time, but after dealing with the immediate crisis, I realized I needed to wash up at the sinks. This meant facing my longtime fear of mirrors. But food poisoning had left me too weak and disoriented to maintain my usual avoidance strategies. I approached the sink area with my head down, focusing on the tile floor and the chrome fixtures without looking up at the mirrored wall above the sinks. I turned on the water, began washing my hands, and tried to keep my eyes focused on the sink basin. But as I reached for paper towels, my peripheral vision caught something that made me freeze in terror. The mirror directly in front of me wasn't showing my reflection. It was showing someone else entirely. A man in his 50s with graying hair and a weathered face was staring back at me from the mirror, his eyes wide with terror and his mouth open in a silent scream. He was wearing a trucker's uniform from what looked like the 1990s, and behind him I could see the interior of a truck cab that was filled with smoke and flames. As I watched in horrified fascination, the man's image began to fade, replaced by another face, a younger driver with a mustache who appeared to be drowning, water rushing into his cab through a shattered windshield. I stumbled backwards from the sink. But every mirror in the bathroom was now displaying different scenes of truckers in their final moments. One mirror showed an older woman trapped in an overturned truck. Another displayed a young man being attacked by something I couldn't clearly see in the darkness of his sleeper berth. The images changed every few seconds, an endless parade of truck drivers experiencing every conceivable form of death. Accidents, murders, heart attacks, equipment failures, natural disasters, and violence from strangers they'd trusted. The worst part wasn't just seeing these death scenes, it was hearing them. Each mirror generated its own audio track of the final moments it was displaying. I could hear the screaming of drivers trapped in burning trucks, the prayers of men and women who knew they were about to die, the confused last words of drivers who didn't understand what was happening to them. The bathroom filled with a cacophony of final breaths, desperate pleas for help, and the mechanical sounds of trucks destroying themselves and their operators. I tried to run from the bathroom, but the door had somehow locked behind me. When I turned back to face the mirrors, I realized the images were becoming more personal. Now I was seeing drivers I recognized, truckers I'd met at various truck stops over the years, faces I remembered from CB radio conversations and Fuel Island encounters. There was Big Eddie from Montana, who I'd shared coffee with just 3 months earlier, dying in a head-on collision with a drunk driver. Maria Santos, a professional driver who'd helped me with directions in Arizona, was trapped in her truck during a flash flood, water rising above her windows as she tried desperately to break the glass. Each familiar face made the experience more traumatic. These weren't just random truckers meeting unfortunate ends. They were people I'd known, drivers who had been part of the extended family that exists among professional drivers. Seeing their deaths playing out in endless loops on the truck stop mirrors felt like attending a funeral for the entire trucking industry. Watching every driver I'd ever met die in the most horrible ways imaginable. Then I realized something even more disturbing. Some of the deaths I was watching hadn't happened yet. The images included scenes with newer truck models, drivers wearing modern safety equipment, and accidents occurring on highways that had only recently been constructed. The mirrors weren't just showing the past. They were displaying future deaths as well, giving me glimpses of truckers who were still alive in 2015, but were destined to die in accidents that hadn't occurred yet. I started recognizing some of these future victims as well. Danny Morrison, a young driver I'd met the previous week, was shown dying in a truck fire that would happen on Christmas Eve 2017. Sarah Kim, a safety-conscious professional I'd spoken with on the CB radio just days earlier, was displayed bleeding to death after being attacked at a rest area that wouldn't open until 2018. The mirrors were showing me a comprehensive catalog of trucker mortality, past, present, and future, all playing simultaneously in an endless loop of death and suffering. The psychological impact was overwhelming. I'd spent 12 years on the road developing relationships with fellow drivers, building the kind of professional camaraderie that comes from shared experiences and mutual respect. Now I was watching all of them die, over and over again, in mirrors that seemed determined to show me every conceivable way a trucker could meet their end. The cumulative effect was like experiencing the grief of losing hundreds of friends and colleagues simultaneously. As I watched the horrific parade of trucker deaths, I began to understand why I'd been afraid of mirrors since childhood. This wasn't a phobia. It was a supernatural ability, a curse that allowed me to see through reflective surfaces into dimensions where death was the only constant. The mirrors weren't showing random scenes of mortality. They were displaying the accumulated suffering of every person who had died violently or tragically. And truckers were just one category in an infinite catalog of human death. I noticed that each mirror seemed to specialize in different types of trucker fatalities. The mirror above the first sink showed only accident victims, displaying an endless stream of collisions, rollovers, and equipment failures. The second mirror focused on violence, showing drivers who had been murdered, attacked, or killed by other humans. The third mirror displayed what I can only describe as supernatural deaths. Truckers killed by creatures, phenomena, or forces that shouldn't exist in rational reality. The supernatural deaths were the most disturbing because they suggested that the trucking industry included dangers that weren't covered in any safety manual or training program. I watched drivers being consumed by shadows that emerged from their cargo, attacked by creatures that lived in truck stop parking lots, and killed by loads that were somehow alive and malevolent. These deaths implied that the world contained horrors that normal people never encountered. Dangers that were specific to truckers because of the isolated, transient nature of life on the road. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the mirrors began showing one final image that made my blood run cold. Every reflective surface in the bathroom displayed the same scene. Me, Hayes, dying in this exact truck stop bathroom. But in the mirror version, I wasn't alone. Standing behind me was a figure I couldn't quite see clearly. Something that had been waiting for me to finally look into a mirror so it could complete whatever purpose it had been pursuing since my childhood. The figure in the mirror reached toward me, and I felt cold fingers touching the back of my neck in the real bathroom. I spun around but saw nothing behind me. Yet the sensation of being touched by something invisible and malevolent continued. The mirrors showed the figure becoming clearer, revealing itself as something that existed only in reflections, something that hunted people who had the ability to see through dimensional barriers. I closed my eyes and felt my way to the bathroom door, which had mysteriously unlocked. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the main area of the truck stop, with normal fluorescent lighting and the usual sounds of late-night commerce. Other truckers were moving around normally, buying coffee and snacks, completely unaware that the bathroom they were using contained portals to a dimension where death was the only entertainment. I've never looked into another mirror since that night. I shave by touch, brush my teeth while staring at the ceiling, and avoid any reflective surface that might show me more than I can psychologically handle. But I know the mirror dimension is still there, still displaying the deaths of every trucker who has died or will die on America's highways. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through areas with no other traffic, I catch glimpses of that supernatural figure in my truck's side mirrors. Still following me, still waiting for another opportunity to drag me into the dimension where reflections show only death. The worst part is knowing that someday, some other trucker with mirror phobia will be forced to use a truck stop bathroom, and they'll see my death playing out on those reflective surfaces, joining the endless catalog of truckers who died because they looked into mirrors that showed too much truth about the price we pay for choosing life on the road. The Hazmat spill on that New Mexico highway didn't just contaminate the asphalt. It contaminated my mind with the memories of every driver who'd ever owned my truck. 20 years of chemical plant experience taught me to respect dangerous materials, but nothing prepared me for a substance that could poison your consciousness with lifetimes of experiences that weren't your own. My name is Jet, And I've been hauling hazardous materials for 8 years, after spending 2 decades working in chemical plants across Texas and Louisiana. I understand dangerous substances better than most drivers. How to read safety data sheets, proper containment procedures, emergency response protocols, and the critical importance of maintaining sealed systems when transporting materials that can kill you in concentrations measured in parts per million. I drive a specialized tanker truck with redundant safety systems, emergency shutoffs, and monitoring equipment that would make a NASA engineer proud. Every load I haul could theoretically wipe out a city block if something goes wrong. So I've built my entire career on the principle that nothing ever goes wrong when proper procedures are followed. That confidence was shattered on a Tuesday morning in September 2013, when I was hauling what the manifest described as experimental industrial solvent from a government facility outside Albuquerque to a disposal site in Colorado. The paperwork was more classified than usual, with sections blacked out and handling instructions that referenced military regulations I'd never seen before. The loading crew wore full hazmat suits with self-contained breathing apparatus, and they sealed the tanker using procedures that seemed excessive, even for the most dangerous chemicals I'd transported. The pay was triple my normal rate, which should have been a warning sign, but the money was too good to pass up. The spill happened about 60 miles north of Albuquerque on a remote stretch of Highway 285, in an area where the landscape consists of nothing but scrub brush and red rock formations that stretch to the horizon without a building or another vehicle in sight. I was maintaining exactly 55 bpb in perfect weather conditions when one of my trailer tires blew out. Not an unusual occurrence, but one that required immediate attention to prevent a more serious accident. I pulled onto the shoulder and began the standard procedure for changing a tire on a hazmat load, which includes checking all seals and connections before beginning any maintenance work. That's when I discovered that the tire blowout had somehow damaged one of the tanker's valve assemblies, creating a small leak that was allowing the experimental solvent to escape in a fine mist that immediately began eating through the asphalt. The chemical was unlike anything I'd encountered in 20 years of industrial experience. It dissolved road surface on contact, created vapor clouds that shimmered like heat waves, and produced a sweet, metallic smell that made my teeth ache even through my respirator. I immediately activated my emergency response procedures, contacting hazmat cleanup teams and cordoning off the area. But I'd already been exposed to trace amounts of the vapor during my initial inspection. The first symptom was disorientation. As I waited for the cleanup crew to arrive, I began experiencing memories that weren't mine. Driving down highways I'd never traveled, delivering loads I'd never hauled, having conversations with people I'd never met. At first, I assumed it was chemical exposure affecting my nervous system, a known side effect of many industrial solvents. But as the memories became more vivid and detailed, I realized they were too consistent and specific to be hallucinations. I was experiencing the actual memories of other people, as if the chemical had somehow extracted them from previous exposure victims and was now downloading them directly into my consciousness. The cleanup crew that arrived wasn't from any hazmat company I recognized. They wore unmarked suits with equipment that looked more advanced than anything commercially available, and they refused to answer questions about the nature of the chemical I'd been transporting. They contained the spill using foam that seemed to neutralize the solvent on contact. But they also drew blood samples from me and ran neurological tests using handheld devices that looked like something from a science fiction movie. When I asked about potential health effects from exposure, they told me to report any unusual symptoms, but wouldn't specify what constituted unusual. Over the following days, the alien memories became stronger and more intrusive. I began experiencing entire lifetimes belonging to other people who had apparently been exposed to the same chemical at some point in the past. Most disturbing were the memories of previous drivers who had owned my truck before I purchased it. I lived through the experiences of Marcus Johnson, who had driven the same tanker in the 1990s and died in an accident that I now remembered as if I had experienced it myself. I felt the terror of Sandra Phillips, who had owned the truck in the early 2000s and had been killed by something she encountered during a late-night delivery to a facility that didn't appear on any map. The memories weren't random. They were specifically connected to my truck, as if the vehicle itself had somehow absorbed the consciousness of every person who had operated it over the years. I learned about modifications that had been made to the tanker's systems, hidden compartments that previous drivers had discovered, and cargo that had been transported without appearing on any official manifest. Each memory revealed another layer of the truck's true history, a legacy of drivers who had been recruited for increasingly dangerous assignments that pushed the boundaries of legal transportation. Through Marcus Johnson's memories, I experienced his gradual realization that the trucking company he worked for was a front for government black ops, transporting materials that were too dangerous or too classified for normal shipping channels. I felt his growing paranoia as he discovered that other drivers who asked too many questions had a tendency to disappear or die in convenient accidents. I lived through his final moments when his truck was deliberately sabotaged during a run through the Nevada desert, killing him to prevent him from revealing what he had learned about the true nature of the cargo he'd been hauling. Sandra Phillips' memories were even more disturbing. Through her experiences, I discovered that some of the loads we transported weren't chemicals at all, but something organic, specimens or entities that were being moved between facilities for research purposes. I experienced her horror when she discovered that her supposedly empty tanker was actually filled with something alive, something that communicated through chemical signals and had been slowly influencing the minds of every driver who transported it. Her death hadn't been an accident. She'd been killed by the cargo itself when she tried to refuse further assignments. As more memories accumulated, I began to understand the true purpose of the experimental solvent that had spilled from my truck. It wasn't just an industrial chemical. It was a memory transfer medium, designed to extract consciousness and experiences from one person and implant them in another. The government facility where I'd picked up the load was conducting experiments in consciousness transfer, and the solvent was the delivery mechanism that allowed them to move memories and personalities between subjects. The most terrifying realization was that my exposure hadn't been accidental. The tire blowout, the valve failure, and the resulting spill had all been deliberately orchestrated to expose me to the memory transfer chemical. I was being prepared for the next phase of the experiment, which involved determining whether consciousness could be permanently transferred from one person to another through controlled chemical exposure. The memories I was receiving from previous drivers weren't side effects. They were the intended result of the procedure. I tried to quit, to refuse any further assignments involving experimental chemicals, but the company informed me that my contract included clauses that made termination impossible. I was legally bound to continue transporting classified materials regardless of personal safety concerns, and any attempt to reveal information about the nature of my cargo would result in federal prosecution under national security laws. I was trapped in a system that viewed drivers as expendable test subjects, useful for determining the effects of experimental chemicals on human consciousness. The memories of dead drivers began taking control of my actions during certain periods of the day. I would find myself driving routes that I hadn't planned, making deliveries to facilities I didn't recognize, and having conversations with people who called me by names that belonged to previous owners of my truck. Marcus Johnson's personality would emerge during night driving. Sandra Phillips would take control during chemical loading procedures, and other deceased drivers would manifest during specific situations that triggered their embedded memories. I started carrying a digital recorder to document the periods when other personalities were in control, hoping to gather evidence of what was being done to me. The recordings revealed conversations with facility personnel who discussed me as Subject 47 in an ongoing consciousness transfer experiment. They monitored my mental state through tracking devices hidden in my truck, adjusted chemical exposure levels based on my neurological responses, and planned to terminate the experiment once they had gathered sufficient data about long-term effects of memory implantation. The experiment's ultimate goal was to create a method for preserving and transferring the skills and knowledge of experienced personnel to replacement subjects. The trucking company was just one testing ground for a technology that could theoretically allow the government to maintain continuity of critical personnel by downloading their consciousness into new bodies. Dead drivers were the perfect test subjects because their memories contained specialized knowledge about transporting dangerous materials, and their deaths could be easily covered up as industrial accidents. I realized that my own death was already planned. The memories I was receiving included glimpses of my future termination, scenes where I would be killed in what would appear to be a chemical exposure accident, but was actually murder designed to cover up the illegal experimentation. My consciousness would then be extracted and implanted in another driver, continuing the cycle of exploitation that had already claimed dozens of victims. The only escape was to document everything I could about the experiment and find a way to expose the truth before my scheduled termination. But with each passing day, more alien memories crowded out my own thoughts, and I found it increasingly difficult to distinguish between my actual experiences and the implanted consciousness of dead drivers. Sometimes I would wake up not knowing whether I was Jet or Marcus or Sandra or one of the other victims whose memories were slowly consuming my identity. The chemical spill on Highway 285 had contaminated more than just the roadway. It had contaminated my mind with the accumulated trauma of every driver who had been murdered by the same system that now controlled my life. And somewhere in the growing collection of alien memories, I could sense that other drivers were still out there, still transporting experimental chemicals, still being used as test subjects in consciousness transfer experiments that would eventually claim their lives and add their memories to the collective nightmare that trucking had become. In 23 years of professional driving, I'd never failed a DOT inspection. My paperwork was always perfect, my equipment always up to code, my logbooks always accurate to the minute. Then I got pulled into a roadside checkpoint that didn't exist on any map, where the inspector started writing citations for violations that wouldn't be created for another decade. My name is Cole, and I built my reputation on being the most compliant, regulation-following driver in the industry. Every bolt on my truck was torqued to specification, every light worked perfectly, every safety device was tested and certified. I carried 3 sets of backup paperwork, maintained digital and physical logbooks, and kept my truck so clean you could perform surgery in the cab. DOT inspections were routine for me, a chance to show off my professionalism and add another perfect score to my safety record. I drove a pristine 2020 Kenworth T680 with every available safety feature, from collision avoidance systems to lane departure warnings, because I believed that following the rules and maintaining perfect equipment would protect me from the dangers of life on the road. The checkpoint appeared on a stretch of highway that I'd driven thousands of times before. Route 287 through rural Texas, where the landscape consists of endless ranch land, broken only by occasional oil derricks and cattle crossings. I was hauling electronics from Dallas to Phoenix, running about 2 hours ahead of schedule, when electronic signs directed me into a mandatory inspection station that I'd never seen before. The facility looked official enough. Concrete buildings, electronic scales, inspection bays with hydraulic lifts, and uniformed officers carrying clipboards and wearing DOT badges. But something felt wrong about the setup from the moment I pulled onto the scales. The inspector who approached my truck was a tall, thin man in his 50s, with gray hair and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. His uniform was regulation DOT, complete with all the proper patches and insignia, but the badge number was longer than normal and included letters that didn't follow standard identification protocols. He asked for my license, registration, and logbooks in the standard manner. But when he opened my paperwork, he began reading from documents that I'd never seen before. "According to your records," he said, consulting a clipboard that appeared to be blank from my angle, "you've been operating in violation of Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulation 395.8K2, which requires neural interface synchronization for all commercial vehicles equipped with autonomous systems." I tried to explain that my truck didn't have autonomous systems and that I'd never heard of Regulation 395.8K2. But he ignored my protests and continued reading from his invisible documentation. He began conducting the most thorough inspection I'd ever experienced, examining every component of my truck with equipment that looked more advanced than anything I'd seen at normal DOT facilities. He used handheld scanners that seemed to read the molecular composition of my tires, checked my engine with diagnostic tools that connected wirelessly to systems my truck didn't have, and measured my fuel with devices that displayed readings in units I didn't recognize. Each piece of equipment revealed violations that shouldn't have been possible with a truck that had passed inspection just 3 months earlier. "Your brake shoes are showing wear patterns consistent with temporal displacement," he announced, writing another citation on a pad that seemed to generate its own text. "That's a violation of Regulation 393.47B8, which prohibits operating commercial vehicles that have been exposed to chronological anomalies." I watched in confusion as he documented brake wear that didn't exist on components that had been recently replaced by certified mechanics using OEM parts from authorized dealers. The citations kept coming, each one more impossible than the last. He found violations for hauling cargo that existed in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, for operating a vehicle that had been in accidents that hadn't happened yet, and for failing to maintain proper documentation for loads that I'd delivered to customers who wouldn't be born for another 50 years. Every violation referenced regulations that didn't exist in any manual I'd ever studied. But the inspector cited them with the authority of someone who had memorized every rule in an extensive legal code. When he opened my trailer doors to inspect the cargo, he discovered violations that defied physical reality. The electronics I was hauling were apparently in violation of Regulation 177.834F3 for containing consciousness transfer protocols and Regulation 177.9 for being temporarily unstable during interstate transport. He used scanners that revealed circuitry patterns in the electronics that weren't visible to normal inspection equipment. Patterns that supposedly indicated my cargo was designed for purposes that violated federal laws about artificial intelligence and human consciousness manipulation. The most disturbing part of the inspection was when he began documenting violations related to my personal history. He cited me for Regulation 391.11B12, which allegedly prohibited commercial drivers from operating vehicles while carrying unresolved temporal paradoxes in their personal timeline. According to his inspection report, I had been involved in accidents that I'd never experienced, delivered loads that I'd never hauled, and violated safety regulations during trips that I'd never taken. "Your logbooks show a pattern of chronological inconsistency," he explained, comparing my official documentation to records that appeared on his scanner's display. "On March 15, 2019, you delivered a load of automotive parts to a facility in Denver that was destroyed in 1987. On June 8, 2020, you refueled at a truck stop in Oklahoma that won't be built until 2031. These temporal violations indicate that you've been operating across multiple timeline intersections without proper interdimensional transit permits. I tried to argue that the dates and locations he was citing were impossible, that I couldn't have delivered loads to facilities that didn't exist or refueled at truck stops that hadn't been built yet. But he produced photographic evidence from his scanner that showed my truck at these impossible locations. Images that looked completely authentic, but depicted scenes that violated everything I understood about linear time and physical reality. The inspector's equipment revealed violations that extended beyond my current trip and into every load I'd ever hauled during my 23-year career. According to his readings, I'd been unknowingly transporting interdimensional cargo, delivering shipments to customers who existed in parallel timelines, and violating regulations that governed commerce between different versions of reality. Each violation carried fines that were calculated in currencies I didn't recognize, using exchange rates that fluctuated based on factors like temporal stability and dimensional convergence rates. As the inspection continued, I began to realize that the violations weren't being discovered. They were being created. The inspector's equipment wasn't just reading my truck's condition and cargo manifest. It was somehow generating new realities where violations existed. Each scan created new problems. Each measurement established new baseline standards that my equipment couldn't meet. Each documentation review revealed new requirements that I'd never had the opportunity to comply with. The inspector explained that I was being cited under the Enhanced Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations of 2035, a set of laws that wouldn't be written for another 13 years, but were apparently already being enforced through what he called temporal regulatory jurisdiction. The checkpoint existed in a bubble of accelerated legal time, where future regulations could be applied to current operations to identify drivers who would eventually become violations risks. Your truck and cargo are currently in compliance with 2022 regulations, he said, reviewing his citations, but our projections show that you'll be involved in 17 safety violations over the next decade if you're allowed to continue operating under current parameters. We're required to address these future violations now, to prevent the accidents and regulatory breaches that would otherwise occur. The fines for violations that I hadn't committed yet, but allegedly would commit in the future, totaled over $400,000, an amount that would bankrupt me and end my trucking career. But the inspector offered an alternative. I could accept immediate termination of my commercial driving privileges and avoid the future violations by never driving again. Or I could continue operating with the understanding that I was now under constant surveillance by temporal regulatory enforcement. I chose to continue driving, but with the knowledge that somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of interdimensional law enforcement, my future violations were already being documented by inspectors who existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. The checkpoint released me with a warning that I was now part of a monitoring program that tracked drivers across past, present, and future operations to ensure compliance with regulations that existed in potential realities rather than current law. Since that inspection, I've noticed that my truck operates differently. GPS systems sometimes show routes through areas that don't exist. Fuel receipts occasionally display purchases at stations I've never visited, and my logbooks sometimes contain entries written in handwriting that isn't mine, but documents trips I apparently took in alternative timelines. I'm being held accountable for violations that exist in parallel versions of my career, fined for accidents that happen to other versions of myself in different realities. The phantom inspection taught me that regulation and compliance exist on levels that transcend normal reality. That somewhere in the bureaucratic structure that governs interstate commerce, There are enforcement mechanisms that operate across multiple dimensions and timelines. I'm still driving, still hauling loads, still maintaining perfect compliance with current regulations. But I know that in some other version of reality, Cole the trucker has already failed every inspection, violated every rule, and paid every fine that could possibly be assessed against a professional driver. The checkpoint still appears on Route 287, but only for drivers who are destined to discover that their perfect safety records are illusions. And that true compliance requires following rules that haven't been written yet, for violations that exist only in the infinite possibilities of what could go wrong on America's highways. After 35 years of driving, I thought I'd earned a peaceful retirement, watching sunsets from my porch instead of my windshield for the first time since 1988. But when the company offered me one final high-paying run, a mystery load with a destination that didn't exist on any map, I discovered that some contracts are written in something darker than ink. And retirement isn't always a choice drivers get to make. My name is Elliot, and for 3.5 decades, I've been the most dependable driver in the Midwest freight industry. I've hauled everything from grain to government secrets, driven through blizzards that shut down entire states, and delivered loads to places that most people couldn't find with GPS and a prayer. My truck, a custom midnight blue Peterbilt 389 with over 2 million miles on the odometer, has been my office, my home, and my closest companion through divorce, bankruptcy, family deaths, and all the other catastrophes that life throws at professional drivers. We've been partners in the truest sense, that truck and I, sharing the road and the responsibility of keeping America's supply chain moving one load at a time. The retirement party was scheduled for Friday, October 13th, 2023, at the company terminal in Kansas City, where I'd started my career in 1988. 3 generations of dispatchers, mechanics, and fellow drivers were planning to celebrate my departure from the industry with barbecue, beer, and the kind of storytelling that happens when truckers get together to reminisce about the good old days before electronic logs and satellite tracking. I'd already cleaned out my truck, transferred my personal items to the car I'd bought for civilian life, and signed the paperwork that would officially end my career as a commercial driver. All that remained was one final ceremonial drive around the parking lot. A symbolic last mile to close out 35 years of professional trucking. That's when the company president, a man I'd barely spoken to during my entire career, approached me with an offer that seemed too good to refuse. A special customer had specifically requested me for one final delivery, a high-priority load that needed to be handled by someone with my experience and reliability. The pay was exceptional, $50,000 for a single run, and the timeline was flexible, allowing me to complete the delivery at my own pace without the pressure of tight schedules or demanding customers. It seemed like the perfect capstone to my career, a chance to earn enough money to make retirement truly comfortable, while doing what I'd always done best. The paperwork for the final load was unlike anything I'd seen in 35 years of trucking. Instead of the standard bill of lading with customer information, pickup locations, and delivery addresses, I received a single sheet of paper with coordinates that led to a warehouse facility I'd never heard of. The cargo description was listed simply as personal effects, handle with extreme care, and the delivery destination was identified only as final destination. Driver will receive specific instructions upon arrival. Most unusual of all, the contract included clauses about confidentiality, discretion, and something called completion obligations that I didn't fully understand but signed anyway, because the money was too good to pass up. The pickup location was a warehouse in an industrial district outside Kansas City that I'd driven past thousands of times but never noticed. The building was unmarked, surrounded by a chain-link fence with no signage or identification, and staffed by workers who seemed to know exactly who I was, despite my never having been there before. They loaded my trailer with what appeared to be a single large container, roughly the size of a shipping crate, but made from metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The container was secured with straps and chains that looked more like restraints than cargo securement, and the loading crew wore protective equipment that seemed excessive for handling personal effects. The route instructions I received after loading were even more mysterious than the pickup had been. Instead of highway directions, I was given a series of coordinates that led through rural areas, along back roads that didn't appear on any map, and eventually to locations that seemed to exist only when approached from specific directions. The GPS in my truck couldn't locate most of the waypoints, and my satellite communication system lost contact with dispatch once I began following the route. I was driving through a version of America that felt familiar, but somehow different, as if I was traveling through a landscape that existed parallel to the normal world, but operated according to different rules. The first waypoint was a truck stop that I'd been visiting for 20 years. But when I arrived, it looked exactly as it had in 1988 when I'd first started driving. The pumps were older models, the building had the original signage, and the staff appeared to be the same people I'd met decades earlier, unchanged by the passage of time. When I tried to pay for fuel with my modern credit card, the clerk looked confused and asked if I had cash, explaining that they didn't accept those new electronic payment systems. I paid with bills from my wallet and left feeling disoriented, as if I'd somehow traveled backward through time rather than forward through space. Each subsequent waypoint revealed more temporal anomalies. A restaurant where I'd eaten lunch in 1995 was serving the same menu with the same prices, staffed by waitresses who remembered me from visits that had happened 28 years earlier. A motel where I'd spent countless nights during my early career had the same rooms available, with the same furnishings, the same television channels, and the same rates they'd charged when gas was under $1 per gallon. Every stop along the route seemed frozen in different periods of my trucking career, as if the final delivery was taking me on a tour through the history of my own professional life. As I continued following the mysterious route, I began to suspect that the cargo I was hauling wasn't personal effects in any conventional sense. The container in my trailer generated its own temperature, maintaining a constant coolness that had nothing to do with refrigeration equipment. It produced subtle sounds, not mechanical noises, but something that resembled breathing or heartbeats. Most disturbing of all, it seemed to be getting heavier as the trip progressed, causing my truck to handle differently and requiring more fuel than the distance should have demanded. The realization of what I was actually transporting came when I stopped for a mandatory rest break at a truck stop that had closed in 2010. The facility was fully operational, complete with fuel, food service, and other drivers who seemed to be from different decades of trucking history. I recognized faces from throughout my career: drivers who had died years earlier, dispatchers who had retired before electronic logs were invented, mechanics who had worked on trucks that were now in museums. They all greeted me as if no time had passed since our last meeting, as if death and retirement were just temporary absences from the eternal community of professional drivers. That's when I understood the true nature of my final contract. The cargo I was hauling wasn't personal effects. It was myself. The container held everything I had been as a professional driver. 35 years of experiences, relationships, skills, memories, and identity. I was transporting my own trucking career to whatever destination awaited drivers who had spent their entire adult lives on the road. The route I was following wasn't geographical. It was chronological, taking me through every significant moment of my career in reverse order, allowing me to revisit the experiences that had defined my life as a trucker. The other drivers at the truck stop explained that every professional driver eventually receives the final contract, the last load that transports them from the world of active driving to whatever comes after retirement. Some drivers receive the contract after accidents, others after illness or old age, but all eventually make the final delivery to a destination that exists outside normal geography. The cargo we haul on that last run is always ourselves. Our professional identity, our accumulated experience, our connection to the trucking industry that shaped our lives. I learned that the retirement party scheduled for October 13th had actually been my funeral. My physical body had died of a heart attack in the company parking lot. But my identity as a professional driver had continued operating independently, accepting one final load and making one last delivery. The contract I'd signed wasn't for a delivery job. It was an agreement to transport my own consciousness to whatever destination awaited truckers who had given their entire lives to the industry. The final destination wasn't a place on any map. It was a state of being where professional drivers continued their careers in service to something larger than earthly commerce. I was delivering myself to an eternal trucking company that operated across dimensions and timelines, hauling cargo between realities and maintaining supply chains that connected the world of the living with whatever lay beyond. The payment for this final delivery wouldn't be deposited in any earthly bank account. It would be the continuation of the only life I'd ever truly known, driving the infinite highways that exist beyond death. As I completed the final mile of my last delivery, I realized that retirement had never been an option for drivers like me. We don't stop driving when we get old. We just accept different loads and travel different routes, continuing to serve the industry that gave meaning to our lives. The blue Peterbilt and I would keep rolling together, delivering whatever cargo needed, hauling across the endless roads that connect all realities, making sure that even in death, the freight keeps moving and America's drivers never truly retire. The road holds secrets that most people will never discover, stories that only surface when drivers push beyond the boundaries of normal experience. If these accounts of supernatural trucking have awakened your curiosity about the mysteries that lurk in the space between truck stops, between CB channels, between 1 mile marker and the next, then you're ready to explore the deeper darkness that exists alongside America's highways. Subscribe to Verified Fears for more tales from drivers who've encountered the impossible, survived the unexplainable, and lived to share their stories with those brave enough to listen. The road never sleeps, and neither do the horrors that call it home.